somewhere in a quiet corner of Baltimore, sometime around 1901, one man gave a piece of offhand career advice to a traveling salesman who happened to work for him. Neither man had any particular reason to think the conversation was historic. At the time, it actually took place. That comment did not just help build one of the largest packaging companies in the entire history of American manufacturing. It also, almost by accident, gave birth to an entirely separate consumer products empire worth billions upon billions of dollars, one that still uses the exact same underlying business model today, more than a century later, whether you have ever heard either man's name or not. This is the story of William Painter, the bottle cap he spent decades of his life perfecting, the company he built to manufacture it at a scale that would eventually span the globe from Baltimore to Asia, and the strange, half-forgotten conversation that connects the cap on your soda bottle to the razor sitting in your bathroom cabinet right now. This very morning, William Painter was born on November 20th, 1838, in Triadelphia, Maryland, into a Quaker family with no particular wealth or standing to speak of. One of several children in a household that valued practical usefulness over formal schooling. He had no higher education of any kind. What he had, by every account of the people who knew him, was an almost compulsive drive to build things. The kind of person later biographers would describe simply as an irrepressible tinkerer who could not leave a mechanical problem alone once he noticed it, chasing small improvements to ordinary objects the way other men chased money or status directly. At 17, in 1855, he took an apprenticeship with a patent lawyer, an unusual choice for a young man with mechanical inclinations that put him inside the machinery of American invention itself, years before he ever produced anything of his own. Watching other men's ideas move through the patent process, learning exactly what made an invention legally defensible and commercially viable long before he had one worth protecting himself. A kind of on-the-job education in the business of ideas that no formal engineering school of the era would have offered him. Over the rest of his life, he would end up holding 85 or more patents in his own name, spanning all manner of small mechanical improvements. But almost everything he is remembered for today traces back to one specific, decades-long obsession that would not let him go: how to seal a bottle properly, cheaply, and reliably. In the late 19th century, sealing a bottle of beer or soda water was a genuinely difficult and unreliable problem, one that the entire beverage industry was actively bleeding money over year after year without any clear end in sight. The standard approach involved a cork or some other plug pushed or screwed into the neck of the bottle, a labor-intensive process with dubious sanitation, prone to leaking under the pressure of a carbonated beverage, and expensive enough in its reusable forms that bottlers had every commercial incentive imaginable to want something cheaper, faster to apply, and more reliable across an entire day's bottling run. Painter was hardly the only person chasing a solution, and he was up against a genuinely crowded field of competing inventors, all sensing the same obvious opportunity. Between 1882 and 1890 alone, inventors filed 337 separate patents for bottle stoppers, and more than 1,500 different stopper designs had been patented by the time Painter finally cracked the problem to his own satisfaction. A genuinely enormous graveyard of failed or merely adequate attempts at what looks, from the outside, like an almost embarrassingly simple engineering challenge that should not have taken the trade the better part of a generation to solve properly. Painter's first real commercial success came in 1885, when he patented two related designs after years of smaller, less successful attempts at the same underlying problem. The Triumph, a wire-retaining stopper that used a looped wire cage to hold a stopper in place under pressure, and the Bottle Seal, sometimes called the Baltimore Loop Seal, a simple flat rubber disc that sat inside a groove molded directly into the bottle's own mouth, rather than relying on any external clamp or cage at all. The genius of the Bottle Seal was in how it used the beverage's own carbonation against the problem, rather than fighting it the way every clamp-based design before it had. Once seated in its groove, the disc formed what engineers of the era described as an inverted arch, a shape that actually grew tighter and more secure, the more internal pressure pushed against it from below, meaning the very carbonation that wanted to escape the bottle was the same force holding the seal shut, a wonderfully self-reinforcing bit of mechanical logic that most of the competing 1500 stopper patents had entirely missed. It was cheap enough to be genuinely disposable, selling for 25 cents a gross, a small fraction of what a reusable stopper cost a bottler over its working life. And painter and a business partner, Samuel Cook, formed the Bottle Seal Company to manufacture and sell it commercially. It sold well across the United States and England both, a genuine and immediate commercial success by any reasonable measure for a young inventor's very first patented product to reach the open market. Painter, characteristically, was not satisfied with merely good. He kept refining the idea for years afterward, unwilling to settle for a design that still required molding a special groove into every single bottle it was meant to fit. And on February 2nd, 1892, he patented what he called the crown cork, the design that would define the rest of his career and, eventually, an entire global industry that still barely resembles its original form more than a century later. The crown cork was a small metal cap with a corrugated flange, crimped down tightly around the outside lip of an ordinary bottle's mouth, requiring no special groove or fitting on the bottle itself, with a disc of cork fitted inside the cap, and, in later versions, a thin paper liner, separating that cork from direct contact with the beverage to avoid any metallic taste leaching into the drink. The corrugations along the flange were not decorative in the slightest. They let the crimping force distribute evenly around the entire circumference of the cap as it was pressed down by a machine, rather than concentrating unpredictably at one point the way a smooth, uncorrugated flange would under the same pressure, which meant the cap sealed reliably every single time, regardless of small variations in exactly how hard or how evenly a given machine happened to press it into place that day, and it could still flex just enough at one edge to be pried off cleanly with a simple lever-style opener rather than requiring the bottle to be broken or the cap laboriously unscrewed by hand. It solved in one simple, cheaply stamped piece of ordinary metal a problem more than 1,500 prior patents had failed to solve as completely or as economically as Painter finally managed to solve it. Painter renamed his operation the Crown Cork and Seal Company to match, and the beverage industry, brewers especially, adopted the design almost immediately and almost universally across the entire trade. Manufacturing the cap alone was not enough to build a business on. Bottlers also needed a way to actually apply it at the speed a rapidly growing beverage industry demanded, and Painter built that too, a foot-powered capping and filling machine that let a single operator fill a bottle with syrup and crown it shut in one coordinated motion, fast enough to process 24 bottles a minute, a remarkable pace for equipment powered by nothing more than a treadle under one worker's foot, decades before electric motors became standard equipment on a bottling line. Crown Cork and Seal opened its first serious production facility on Guilford Avenue in Baltimore in 1897, custom building sealing machinery there for beverage companies across the country, rather than simply shipping identical machines to every customer, and by 1906 had expanded into a much larger manufacturing complex in the city's Highlandtown neighborhood, growing again in 1910 to include new buildings with modern fireproofing, fireproof elevator shafts, fire escapes, and ventilation systems built directly into their construction from the start. Genuinely advanced industrial architecture for its era. The invention's success did not go entirely uncontested, and the dispute over who actually deserved credit for it turned genuinely strange in a way that reads almost like a minor industrial spy novel. A rival claimant named Bernardin also asserted credit for inventing the beer bottle crown at roughly the same period, working along similar lines and reaching similar conclusions about corrugated flanges and crimped metal caps entirely independently, or so each side would eventually claim in court. According to one contemporary account preserved by later collectors of the company's history, a factory superintendent working on a competing design disappeared without explanation for roughly a month, only to resurface in Baltimore, having apparently been hired away in the meantime by the group of men founding Crown Cork and Seal, the superintendent later claiming he had been personally instrumental in developing the very design at the center of the dispute between the two rival camps. Both sides filed competing patent applications. A lawsuit followed, and the resulting appeals were reversed back and forth through several different courts over a period of years before the matter was finally settled. A small, half-forgotten legal skirmish, oddly cloak and dagger, for an argument fundamentally about who first thought to crimp a corrugated metal disc onto the top of a beer bottle, over what looks, in hindsight, like one of the simplest and most obviously correct inventions in the entire history of consumer packaging. There is a second story tangled up inside this one, and it does not involve a bottle at all, though almost nobody encountering it for the first time expects the two to be connected. Sometime around 1891, a traveling salesman named King Camp Gillette went to work for Painter's operation, then still doing business as the Baltimore Seal Company, covering sales territory across New England and New York for a living, one of countless anonymous traveling salesmen crisscrossing the country by rail in that era. Gillette was born on January 5, 1855 in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and raised largely in Chicago, where his family's fortunes were badly damaged by the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 when he was still a teenager, forcing him into the workforce years earlier than he might otherwise have chosen. He spent the following 2 decades bouncing between a string of ordinary jobs, hardware stores, and sales routes among them, without ever quite finding the one idea that would make his name, an unremarkable career trajectory for a man who would eventually become one of the most recognized names in American consumer products. Gillette and Painter developed a genuine friendship despite Painter being his employer, and eventually, the company's president, one Gillette himself would later describe warmly in his own memoirs as a meeting of what one biographer called kindred inventive spirits. 2 men who each recognized in the other the same restless compulsion to keep tinkering with ordinary objects until something better emerged from the effort. At some point, likely at Painter's own country home outside Baltimore, which he called the Colonies, Painter offered his young salesman a piece of advice that Gillette would spend the rest of his life crediting as the spark for absolutely everything that followed. Painter told him, in essence, that Gillette was clearly a man who was always thinking up new inventions, and suggested he try inventing something built on the exact same underlying principle as the crown cork itself, a product used once and then thrown away, so the customer had no real choice but to keep coming back for more. Building, as Painter put it, a permanent foundation of profit with every single additional sale, rather than making one sale and being done with that customer forever. Gillette became genuinely obsessed with the idea, in a way that outlasted the conversation itself by years, running through mental lists of nearly every ordinary object he could think of during his long, tedious sales trips, searching specifically for something disposable worth inventing, rather than waiting passively for inspiration to arrive on its own. The answer arrived, by his own later account, on an entirely ordinary morning in Brookline, Massachusetts, when he went to shave and found his straight razor's blade too dull to use comfortably, the kind of small daily annoyance most men of the era simply endured without a second thought. Standing there with the dull blade in his hand, Gillette worked out the idea that would become the safety razor, a razor built around a thin, cheap stamped steel blade designed to be thrown away and replaced rather than stropped and resharpened indefinitely the way every razor before it had required. Exactly the disposable, repeat purchase product Painter had described to him roughly a decade earlier at that same country house conversation. Gillette's own company grew slowly at first, selling just 51 razors and 168 blades in its very first year of operation. Numbers small enough that the whole venture could easily have been written off as one more failed patent idea, destined for the same graveyard as the 1,500 earlier bottle stoppers, before jumping to more than 90,000 razors and over 123,000 blades the very next year, and expanding internationally within just a few years of its 1901 founding, renamed the Gillette Safety Razor Company in 1904 as the business found its footing. Its real explosive growth came with the First World War, when the United States military outfitted departing soldiers with compact shaving kits built around Gillette's disposable blades as standard field equipment, introducing an entire generation of American men to the razor and blade business model all at once through their own government-issued gear, and turning what had been a modest specialty product sold mostly to curious early adopters into a genuine household staple almost overnight, once those soldiers came home from the war with the habit already firmly formed. It is worth sitting with how directly this traces back to a bottle cap conversation held years earlier in a Maryland country house. The same underlying business insight: sell the durable part cheaply or barely profitably and make the real recurring money on the disposable part. The customer has no real choice but to keep buying, would go on to define entire industries across the following century, from printers and inkjet cartridges to game consoles and their software libraries, and its clearest documented origin point anywhere in American business history is a mentor's passing remark to an employee about a bottle cap that most people alive today have never once thought to examine closely. Back in Baltimore, Crown Cork and Seal kept growing on the strength of the invention that had started it all, expanding well beyond what even Painter himself might have originally imagined for a simple bottle cap. By the 1930s, the company supplied roughly half of all bottle caps used anywhere in the world, with manufacturing operations established across Europe, South America, and Asia, an almost total global dominance of an object most people never thought about twice in their entire lives. William Painter did not live to see that full extent of it. He died on July 15, 1906, at 67 years old, having lived long enough to watch his invention become thoroughly established across the beverage trade, and to leave the company at what was, at the time of his death, the height of its power and influence. What he could not control, of course, was who came after him. Management passed into the hands of family members, rather than the professional engineers and business managers who had actually built the company's reputation. And the business, under the direction of one of Painter's own sons-in-law, was by most accounts nearly run into the ground within just a few years of the founder's death, a familiar pattern for founder-led companies whose next generation inherits the ownership without necessarily inheriting the founder's particular talents. The company's fortunes did not improve on their own after Painter's death, and in fact, kept deteriorating along several fronts at once. In 1909, Painter's original foundational patents expired, opening the Crown Cork design to open competition for the first time in nearly 2 decades, and letting rival manufacturers finally produce their own versions without paying Crown Cork and Seal a licensing fee. Then, in 1920, Prohibition eliminated the entire market for beer bottle caps in the United States in a single day, an instant, total collapse of what had been the company's original and most reliable customer base since the very beginning of the business, a shock no ordinary business downturn could compare to, since it was not a gradual decline in demand, but the overnight legal extinction of an entire category of customer. Crown Cork and Seal pivoted toward the growing soft drink industry to compensate for the loss, hoping the same Crown Cork design that had built its beer business could simply transfer over to sodas and other carbonated soft drinks without much friction. But by most contemporary accounts, it proved a genuinely weak substitute for the volume beer bottling had once reliably provided year after year. And by the later 1920s, the company's profits were underperforming badly enough that outside observers openly described the business as sinking. A startling turn for a company that had, within living memory, supplied the sealing equipment behind an entire national industry, and once looked practically unassailable. It took an outside figure to turn things around, and it happened almost accidentally. Charles E. McManus, a Baltimore native, had founded his own separate operation, the New Process Cork Company, in 1912, where he perfected a material called composition cork, made from ground cork granules bound together with an adhesive, rather than relying on scarce, expensive natural cork sheets cut whole from a tree. A genuine material science improvement that stretched a limited natural resource considerably further than traditional methods allowed. McManus eventually took over leadership of the struggling Crown Cork and Seal itself, merging his own cork expertise directly into the company that most needed it, and gave the ailing business, in the words of later company historians, a genuine second life, just as its original product and its original market were both under serious and simultaneous strain from 2 entirely separate directions at once. The rebuilt company weathered real physical disaster, as well as financial trouble in the years that followed McManus's turnaround. In 1940, plant managers at one of the Baltimore facilities placed 26 separate calls to the fire department over a stretch of time, nearly all of them false alarms that turned out to be nothing more than equipment malfunctions or overcautious staff. until one call finally signaled a very real 5-alarm blaze that consumed $500,000 worth of baled cork stock stored on site. The company minimized the damage as best it could and kept shipping bottle caps to brewers around the world without significant interruption to its actual customers. A company by then well practiced at absorbing shocks to its supply chain and simply continuing to operate rather than letting any single crisis define it. In 1958, Crown Cork and Seal relocated its corporate headquarters from Baltimore to Philadelphia, selling a group of 30 of its old Baltimore buildings, including the original Guilford Avenue complex where the whole manufacturing operation had begun back in 1897, to the city of Baltimore itself for $1.5 million, closing out more than 6 decades of continuous headquarters presence in the very city where William Painter had built the entire enterprise from nothing more than a patent and a partnership. Unlike so many of the companies in this history, Crown Cork and Seal did not fade quietly into a conglomerate's forgotten subsidiary, nor did it collapse into bankruptcy proceedings the way so many of its machine tool contemporaries eventually did. It transformed itself instead, expanding well beyond bottle caps alone into aluminum and steel can manufacturing at a scale that made it, by the time of its 100th anniversary in 1992, one of the largest can producers on the entire planet, operating roughly 144 plants worldwide and generating close to $4 billion in annual sales from a business that had started a century earlier, as one Baltimore Quaker's stubborn refusal to accept that sealing a bottle needed to remain as unreliable and expensive as it had always been. Its own home city newspaper noted at the time of that anniversary that the company's strategy of staying focused squarely on manufacturing itself, rather than diversifying into unrelated financial or service businesses, the way so many of its old competitors eventually chose to do over the preceding decades, had left it standing as the last major American-owned can company still operating anywhere in the country, its rivals having either abandoned manufacturing entirely in favor of other lines of business or been quietly absorbed by foreign buyers looking to expand into the American market. The company continues today, renamed Crown Holdings, still counted among the Fortune 500, still tracing its entire existence back to one Quaker inventor with no formal engineering education who simply refused to accept that a problem more than 1,500 other patents had already failed to solve properly and, economically, was somehow permanently unsolvable. Almost nobody who pries a metal cap off a glass bottle today has any reason to think about the man who solved that problem back in 1892, and fewer still would ever guess that the same conversation, which helped build his packaging empire, also gave the world its first disposable razor, decades before anyone thought to ask whether the two ideas were really the same idea, wearing two different faces. Painter never lived to see either legacy reach its full scale. Gillette, for his part, spent the rest of his own long career watching the razor business grow into something considerably larger than the modest bottle cap company where the whole idea had first taken root, and by the time both men were gone, the underlying insight they had shared in a Maryland country house sometime around 1901 had already quietly become one of the most consequential business ideas of the entire 20th century, embedded so deeply in how modern commerce sells everything from printers to game consoles that almost nobody using it today has any reason to trace it back to a single bottle cap conversation between an inventor and his traveling salesman, held decades before either man could have guessed how far the idea would eventually travel.